I'm Andrew Cooper, Associate Director of CG. We're talking from Rome today with Domenico Lombardi, who's the President of the Institute for Economic Policy in Oxford and a non-resident fellow of the Brookings Institution. Domenico will talk about the G20 in very specific terms, but also how the G20 can be used as a catalyst for reform within international finance. The G20 is often called a crisis committee. What is your assessment of that phrase?
Well, I think at the present times it is a very well-pointed definition. The G20 until last year was a sort of think tank group where representatives from various ministries and central banks from systemically important countries would discuss relatively important issues. But it is with the advent, with the breaking of this crisis, that the G20 really was brought to the fore as a sort of crisis committee. Why is that? Certainly because the G8 does not include anymore in its membership all the countries that account for the global macroeconomic disturbances that we have gone through. And the G20, of course, does include all those members. And of course, it is much more suitable than the G8 to discuss issues of broader macroeconomic relevance.
Do you have any sense about the core agenda? What should the G20 focus on?
I think the G20 is very cleverly forging an important and interesting agenda. On the one hand, it is discussing how G20 countries can deal directly with this crisis in terms of macroeconomic response to the crisis, in terms of how to improve financial regulation to the crisis. And this, of course, is an important leg of a broader response that the G20 is crafting. There is also a multilateral leg to this broader G20 strategy, and it has to do with the reform of the IFIs, in particular with the IMF and the World Bank. We know that the G20 have set up various working groups dealing with multilateral institutions. They have already delivered their reports. Their communiques have referred in several important ways to reforming multilateral institutions. They have referred to the need of having an open merit-based selection of the leadership of the multilateral institutions. And therefore, they are really, the G20 is really starting to play a very fundamental role. Of course, on the one hand, the G20 will be asking more and more reforms from the multilateral institutions, but at the same time, the G20 will also and is already providing a lot of political capital to these institutions. And this is, of course, an important condition that allows the G20 to be a catalyst for reform of multilateral institutions.
One of the unanticipated aspects of the crisis is how the IMF has come back in terms of its exposure, in terms of its projection, in terms of its resources. What is your assessment of the IMF playing out from the crisis?
Well, until a year ago, the IMF was considered by almost everybody within and outside the IMF irrelevant. As we know, at the London summit, the IMF was given much more capital, many more resources that it had hoped for. Of course, it's not just a matter of how many resources the IMF was promised at the London summit, but it's especially the political support that the leaders of the G20 were willing to provide to the IMF. That's really the key point, the key break with respect to the past. And I think that if leaders from G20 countries will keep providing this political capital to the IMF, we will be moving towards a better multilateral system.
Do you see Pittsburgh as the end or the beginning of this reform process?
Certainly, the G20 summit in Washington in November last year was seen by some people as a one-off, a sort of self-contained summit. Then we had the London summit. Now we will have the Pittsburgh summit. I think the G20 has set up a process that will not be easily reversible. So in September we'll be having this Pittsburgh summit, but I'm pretty confident that a new summit will be announced and that G20 leaders will be engaged with reform of the international financial architecture, the reform of the world economy, of the governance of the world economy, because in the end it is really something that it is affecting everybody of us, all the citizens in the world. So I think it is fair and it is welcome that world leaders will be discussing these issues periodically.